Welcome to the deep dive. You know that feeling when you look at the news or listen to politicians talk about the challenges facing the country or the world, and it just feels impossibly complicated.
Uh-huh, like a tangled web.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
everything is connected to everything else, and trying to fix one problem seems to make three new ones pop up somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. Governing in today's world can feel exactly like that, navigating a massive, tangled, complex machine where pulling one lever has unpredictable effects across the entire system.
It really does.
It's the defining challenge of modern statecraft, really.
Hmm.
The issues we face, economic shifts, geopolitical tensions, social divides, technological disruption, they aren't isolated events.
Right.
They are deeply intertwined, dynamic, and constantly interacting in ways that linear cause and effect thinking often struggles to grasp. Reactive policies, just treating symptoms rather than systemic causes, they frequently fall short.
Absolutely. And that's precisely what our source material for today grapples with. We're diving into a really thought-provoking white paper titled Statecraft as Systems Craft by William L. Weaver.
Interesting title.
It is. And this paper proposes a specific, powerful way to cut through that complexity. It suggests we look at governance and, crucially, the political discourse of leaders through the lens of systems thinking.
Yes, the core idea is that effective statecraft in this complex environment isn't just about mastering specific policy areas like economics or defense.
Okay.
It's about understanding the underlying complex systems, societies, economies, international relations, technological ecosystems, you name it.
Right. The whole picture.
And the paper makes a compelling case that the way leaders talk about these challenges, their public discourse, offers a window, sometimes a very clear one, into their mental models of how these complex systems actually work.
Or maybe how they think they work.
Or perhaps why they aren't working as intended, exactly.
Yeah.
It's about their perception of the system.
So, our mission for you in this deep dive is to unpack this specific systems thinking framework that the paper lays out. We want to understand its core philosophical ideas, break down its components,
Makes sense.
and then see exactly how the author uses it to analyze recent remarks from two significant political figures, Secretary Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance.
Okay.
It's about giving you a new, perhaps surprising analytical tool to think about political speech and how policies might actually interact within the vast interconnected systems of the real world.
It's a unique analytical approach, definitely, one that encourages looking past the surface level political debate, the back and forth.
Yeah, the soundbite.
To understand the underlying assumptions about systemic function. We'll build up the framework, see how the paper applies it, using specific examples from those speeches.
Okay.
And connect it all back to why developing a systems perspective is important, not just for leaders, but for you in navigating today's world.
Okay, let's unpack this. The paper begins by setting the stage, highlighting the fundamental challenge facing anyone involved in statecraft today.
Right. The paper's foundational premise is that the world is not, just a collection of isolated parts. It's a global system of systems.
A system of systems, I like that.
Interconnected and changing at an accelerating pace. This means that attempts to govern or influence one part in isolation are bound to have unintended consequences elsewhere.
That domino effect.
Exactly. Traditional approaches often struggle because they simplify reality into manageable but ultimately artificial silos. Governing effectively requires understanding these connections and dynamics.
It reminds me of the difference between fixing like a single broken component in a simple machine versus trying to improve the health of a complex biological organism.
That's a great analogy.
You can't just swap out one organ without considering its interaction with all the others in the environment. Right?
Yeah, precisely. And the paper's central thesis, picking up on that idea, is that a leader's effectiveness in this complex environment is profoundly shaped by their internal understanding, their mental models of these systems.
How they see the world working in their head.
Yeah. How do they perceive cause and effect? What connections do they see? What feedback loops do they anticipate? The paper argues that political discourse isn't just rhetoric, it's a reflection of these mental models.
Okay, interesting.
By analyzing what leaders say through a specific lens, we can gain insight into their implicit understanding of the complex systems they are trying to govern.
That's a fascinating angle. So the language used, the arguments made, the priorities articulated, they aren't just political messaging. They are diagnostic signals about how the speaker believes the world works.
Precisely. And the paper is very careful to state, and we should emphasize this too, that its goal isn't to validate or critique the political views of the speakers themselves.
Right. This isn't about taking sides.
Not at all. Instead, it uses remarks from Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance as case studies, as opportunities to apply a specific analytical tool, the 10 Systems Thoughts framework, to see what it reveals about the structure of their thinking regarding complex systems.
As interpreted by the paper's author.
Exactly. It's about understanding the analytical method and its application, not endorsing the specific political positions discussed.
Got it. It's like using a specific type of X-ray vision to see the underlying systemic assumptions driving their discourse, rather than judging whether you agree with the visible surface.
That's a good way to put it. And the tool for this is the 10 Systems Thoughts framework.
So let's build this toolkit. The paper explains that this framework is inspired by prominent systems thinkers, like Jamshid Grajadagi.
Right.
And it provides a multifaceted lens for understanding human endeavors and societal systems.
Yes, the framework posits that there are 5 core fundamental domains of human study and activity, and each of these domains has a characteristic output.
Okay, 5 domains, each with an output.
And when you combine the domain and its output, you get 10 key points, the 10 systems thoughts that, when viewed together, offer a more holistic picture of any complex human system, including statecraft.
10 points to help us analyze the world. Let's go through them one by one and build this framework piece by piece. What's the first pairing?
Okay, the first domain is science is the study of truth. Its output is data.
Science, truth, data. Okay.
This is the realm focused on seeking verifiable understanding of reality. It's about empirical methods, observation, experimentation, trying to figure out how things objectively work in the physical and social world.
Hard facts.
Pretty much. The output of this process is data. The facts, the measurements, the observations, the evidence. This is the foundation for understanding any system. You need reliable data to even begin to describe its state or function.
Right.
Think of climate science, economic statistics, sociological surveys. These are all about gathering data to understand complex systems.
Okay, so science is about gathering the raw information, the objective facts, the data that describe the system's state. What's the second domain?
The second is art is the study of membership. Its output is beauty.
Art, membership, beauty. Okay, that sounds a bit less intuitive for politics.
It does at first glance.
Yeah.
But the paper uses art here, not just in the aesthetic sense, like painting or music.
Right.
It's used as the domain where humans explore connections, belonging, integration, and identity. It's about how individual parts come together to form a cohesive whole.
Ah, okay.
How people relate to each other and feel part of something larger than themselves. The beauty here isn't necessarily visual beauty.
But more like harmony, cohesion.
Exactly. It's the sense of harmony, cohesion, integrity, or meaningful relationship within a system. It's that feeling when the parts fit together in a way that feels integrated and right. Think about shared identity, culture, community feeling.
So if science is about the factual connections, art in this framework is about the relational connections, the sense of belonging, integration, and the resulting cohesion or beauty of a well-structured or harmonious system, like a thriving community or a unified nation.
You've got it. It's about the social and cultural fabric, the sense of shared purpose and identity that binds the system together.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Good. The third pairing takes us into the realm of priorities. Religion values is the study of value. Its output is judgment.
Religion values, leading to judgment.
And the paper emphasizes that religion here is used very broadly. It's not just about organized religion.
Okay.
It encompasses any system of beliefs, ethics, or principles that establishes hierarchies of importance. It's about determining what matters most, what is good or right, what principles should guide individual and collective behavior.
This feels incredibly relevant to statecraft.
Yeah.
What are the fundamental guiding principles of a society or a government? What are the core priorities?
Precisely. And the output of studying value, according to the framework, is judgment. Our values provide the criteria by which we evaluate options, make decisions, and prioritize actions.
So values drive our choices.
They guide our choices within the system. If a society values, say, economic growth above all else, its judgments about policy will look very different than if it prioritizes environmental sustainability or social equity.
Okay, so we have science for the facts, data, art for the connections and cohesion, beauty, and religion values for priorities and guiding principles, judgment. These are fundamental inputs and frameworks. What about the actual doing of things in society, the economy, and politics?
Those are the fourth and fifth pairs. Fourth is economics is the study of exchange. Its output is markets.
Economics, exchange, markets. Seems straightforward.
It's the domain focusing on how resources, skills, ideas, goods, and services are transferred, transformed, and allocated within a system. How do things flow between individuals, groups, and institutions? What are the mechanisms for valuation and distribution? This leads to the emergence of markets, which are the complex systems that facilitate this exchange and allocation. It's about the movement, distribution, and transformation of value in a practical sense.
So, economics in this framework is about the circulation and valuation of things within the system, leading to the creation of markets as the mechanisms of that exchange.
Yes, it's the dynamic engine of resource flow and transformation. And finally, the fifth pairing. Politics is the study of force. Its output is action.
Politics, fourth, leading to action. Force sounds a bit strong.
Well, force here is used broadly, too. It's the domain concerned with power, influence, authority, governance, and collective decision-making.
Ah, okay. Power and influence.
Right. It's about how different forces, social, economic, military, cultural, are applied, negotiated, and organized to translate intentions, values, and understandings into collective behavior and outcomes.
And the result is action.
The output is action. The laws passed, the policies implemented, the decisions made, the influence exerted that shapes the system's direction and determines its state.
Okay, so politics is about how power and influence are used to do things, to make collective decisions, leading to tangible actions that affect the system.
Yeah.
So, to recap the full framework, the 10 systems thoughts, science studies truth, outputting data, art studies membership, outputting beauty, meaning cohesion.
Right.
Religion values studies value, outputting judgment.
Yeah.
Economics studies exchange, outputting markets.
Correct.
And politics studies force, meaning power and influence, outputting action.
Exactly. And the absolutely crucial point the paper emphasizes, and which is central to systems thinking, is that these are not isolated silos.
They all connect.
Deeply interconnected and constantly influencing one another. Changes or interventions in one domain inevitably ripple through and affect the others. Data from science informs economic models, which influence political actions based on value judgments, impacting social membership, and so on.
Right.
Understanding this complex interplay is key to navigating modern challenges.
That interconnectedness is where the real complexity and the power of this framework seems to lie. It forces you to see the ripple effects.
It does. And the paper then uses this framework as the analytical lens to examine the specific remarks of Secretary Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance, seeing what insights this systems thinking approach can reveal about their perspective on statecraft.
So let's apply this lens. First, the paper turns its attention to Secretary Marco Rubio's remarks, focusing on his points about nationhood, industrial capacity, and the concept of national interest.
Right. The paper sets the stage by highlighting how Rubio's speech anchors itself in what he sees as fundamental, enduring aspects of human nature,
Okay.
and their connection to national identity and purpose in a changing world.
And the paper notes he starts with the assertion that human nature does not change, specifically emphasizing the desire to belong, and directly linking that fundamental human need to a concept of nationhood.
Yes, and the paper sees this as a powerful connection to the framework's domain of art, is the study of membership.
Back to art membership.
Exactly. By arguing that a fundamental, unchanging human drive is the desire to belong, and then linking this drive to the formation and significance of nations, Rubio is, through the paper's interpretation, speaking directly to the human endeavor of forming cohesive groups, building collective identities, and fostering a sense of shared membership.
Okay.
The beauty he implicitly references in the framework's terms is the integrity and cohesion that comes from a functional nation that provides this sense of belonging and shared identity to its citizens.
Okay, so the very existence and importance of nations, in this view, is tied back to a fundamental human need for belonging, placing nationhood squarely in the realm of art membership, studying how individuals connect and integrate to form a cohesive whole.
That's the paper's analysis, yes. He's grounding his perspective in what the paper would call the art dimension of the system.
Got it.
The paper then moves to Rubio's critique of what he calls the post-Cold War orthodoxy.
This is where he takes on the prevailing idea after the Cold War that Nationhood no longer mattered when it came to economics, and that the sole focus should be on production efficiency, regardless of where that production happened globally.
Yes. And the paper unpacks this critique using multiple points of the framework, showing how, in the paper's view, Rubio highlights the systemic failures of that past approach.
How so?
Firstly, the paper connects this to science truth data. The paper suggests that the policy focused purely on efficiency metrics, driven by certain economic theories, was based on an incomplete or perhaps even fundamentally flawed understanding of the real-world data.
They weren't seeing the whole picture.
Kind of. It focused on one set of data, efficiency, while ignoring or downplaying other crucial data points about societal resilience, community impact, and geopolitical realities. The truth about the complex system was only partially captured.
So the model's guiding policy weren't based on the full picture of reality. They cherry-picked data points that fit a narrow theory.
That's the paper's interpretation, that the truth about the complex system was only partially captured by the data being prioritized. The paper also connects this critique directly to economics, exchange markets.
Okay.
The specific model of economic exchange that became dominant, aggressively offshoring production solely for theoretical cost efficiency, had unintended negative outputs that profoundly impacted domestic markets and societal well-being.
Right, the consequences.
The paper emphasizes Rubio's point about the concrete consequences.
Hmm.
The erosion of domestic industrial capacity and the devastation of communities that depended on that industry.
And that devastation of communities links back to the art membership domain we just discussed, right?
Right.
Losing jobs, losing industries, losing the economic base of a town that isn't just an economic statistic.
Not at all.
It's a fundamental blow to that sense of belonging, identity, and cohesion, degrading the beauty of the local and national system.
Exactly. And the paper highlights this chain of events as a clear example of systemic feedback loops.
Feedback loops. Okay. Explain that a bit more.
Sure. It means an action taken in one domain, like an economic policy promoting offshoring based on a specific value judgment of efficiency, created effects like erosion of industrial capacity, job losses that fed back into other domains, like the devastation of communities impacting membership art or increased national vulnerability impacting politics force.
So the consequences loop back and affect the system again.
Precisely. The system reacted, and the initial action created negative reinforcement loops that degraded the overall system's health and resilience in multiple areas. It's like a chain reaction, where the output of one step becomes the input for another, creating a cycle.
That's a crucial systems concept, that actions have consequences that don't just disappear. They circulate back through the system, often amplifying effects, both positive and negative. And optimizing one part in isolation can trigger negative feedback loops elsewhere.
Absolutely. The paper also incorporates Rubio's observation about global context, noting China's strategic manipulation of economic exchange.
Right, not just playing by pure market rules.
Not just for pure profit, but driven by political and strategic values. The paper suggests that pure free enterprise models, while perhaps fitting a specific economic theory based on certain assumptions about science truth, failed because they didn't account for the reality of other players in the global economic exchange system whose actions were fundamentally driven by national politics, force, and strategic values, religion ethics, that differed significantly from a purely market-driven approach.
So the system wasn't just an economic one, it was also a political and values-driven one, and a framework that ignored those other forces was bound to misread the situation.
Precisely. The paper then moves to Rubio's connection between domestic industrial capacity and national security, citing the historical example of WWII.
The arsenal of democracy concept that America's ability to produce goods was fundamental to its ability to win the war.
Yes, and the paper analyzes this through the critical interplay of economics as the system of production and exchange, and politics as the application of national force and the capacity for action.
Okay, linking economics and politics.
The paper argues that Rubio highlights how a nation's ability to make things isn't just about commerce. It's a fundamental component of its state capacity, its ability to project force, its capacity for independent political action on the global stage.
Makes sense.
The paper also knows Rubio's point about supply chain vulnerabilities exposed by recent events, reinforcing how the structure of the economic system, where and how things are made and moved, directly impacts the political and security system's capacity.
So, economic decisions about building factories overseas aren't just economic. They have direct, potentially negative consequences for a nation's political power and its ability to act when needed. They limit the political system's capacity for action.
That's how the paper connects those two domains using the framework. Finally, the paper discusses Rubio's call to recenter American foreign policy on the national interest.
Shifting focus from abstract concepts like international order or a broad focus on the world.
And the paper interprets this as a clear and explicit call to reevaluate and reprioritize values, religion ethics.
Back to values.
What is the primary guiding principle for American foreign policy? The paper analyzes Rubio's assertion as stating that the highest value, the core principle guiding decisions, should be the well-being and security of the United States itself.
Okay.
This isn't just a strategic or economic tweak. It's a statement about fundamental values and priorities for the nation system as a whole.
And changing the primary value, according to the framework, fundamentally changes the judgments that follow and the actions taken.
Absolutely. If national interest is the highest value, then policy choices, alliances, and interventions will be judged based on that criterion. This leads to different policy choices and dictates different political actions compared to a framework where, say, promoting global trade efficiency or upholding abstract international legal frameworks were the highest values.
The paper is careful to frame Rubio's argument here as a pragmatic approach, acknowledging that other nations also prioritize their interests, and diplomacy involves finding alignment between these self-interested systems. It's not necessarily isolationism.
No, more like realism, rooted in a clear value hierarchy, according to the analysis. It's analyzing the system of international relations as composed of interacting nation systems, each driven by its own core values and interests.
Okay.
The paper concludes its analysis of Rubio by summarizing how, through this framework's lens, he demonstrates an implicit engagement with systems thinking.
How so? What's the summary?
He highlights fundamental interconnectedness, economy with geopolitics, industry with security, identifies negative feedback loops, the offshoring cycle, emphasizes the influence of the external environment, global competition, and calls for aligning actions with a clear hierarchy of values.
Right.
His critique of past policies, in the paper's view, stems from an understanding that optimizing isolated parts of the system without considering the whole leads to detrimental systemic consequences.
So the paper sees Rubio as operating with an intuitive understanding that policies are interventions in complex systems, and you have to consider the knock-on effects across different domains: art, science, economics, politics, all driven by underlying values.
That's the paper's interpretation of the structure of his arguments, yes. Now let's turn our systems lens to the analysis of Vice President J.D. Vance's remarks.
Okay, shifting gears to Vance.
The paper notes that Vance brings a strong focus on the lived experience of everyday Americans.
Which immediately sounds like he's prioritizing a certain kind of data, the qualitative, on-the-ground reality for citizens, perhaps contrasting with purely abstract or theoretical data.
Exactly. And the paper starts with Vance's central concern: the stagnating living standards for normal Americans, and his focus on the desire for a good life, characterized by dignified work and a living salary.
That phrase, the good life, again seems to directly point to the framework's third domain.
It immediately resonates with religion as the study of value. Its output is judgment. Vance is defining what he believes should be the core value that the societal system is striving to achieve for its citizens: the good life, with dignified work and a living wage. He's fundamentally arguing that policies and the economic system itself should be judged based on their ability to deliver this outcome for the majority of Americans.
So the paper interprets his critique of past policies like offshoring or underinvestment in domestic capacity as a judgment that these policies failed because they did not uphold this core value of ensuring a good life for everyday people.
That's the idea.
They might have succeeded on other metrics, but they failed on this fundamental value, impacting the economics exchange markets system in ways that produced undesirable outputs.
Precisely. It's a value-driven critique that leads to a judgment about the performance of the economic system. The paper then highlights Vance's point about a significant disconnect between elites and normal people.
This is where he talks about a misalignment in perspectives and uses an anecdote about his experience advocating for antitrust action, contrasting it with a citizen who told him they just wanted to see corporate executives in prison.
Right, and he says the American people are much, much wiser about these things than intellectuals give them credit for.
Okay, how does the paper analyze that?
Through multiple lenses of the framework. Firstly, it connects it back to science truth data. Vance is suggesting that there's a divergence in the perceived truth and relevant data about the system's state.
Different realities.
He implies that the lived experience of ordinary citizens constitutes a vital form of collective data about the system's functioning that is often ignored or undervalued by elites, who may rely on different, more abstract forms of data or theoretical models. He's highlighting a failure to integrate all relevant data sources.
So the data derived from the on-the-ground reality feels different and perhaps more accurate in Vance's view than the data from abstract theories or models favored by some elites.
That's the paper's interpretation of his point, and the paper also links this disconnect to art membership.
How does it connect to membership?
When elites and the general populace perceive reality differently, when their lived experiences of the system diverge sharply, it signals a breakdown in shared understanding and a fraying of the sense of common membership.
Oh, okay.
The beauty of a cohesive, integrated system, where different parts understand and relate to each other, is diminished when there are such profound gulfs in perspective and experience. Elites become cloistered, as Vance puts it,
Right.
which impacts the ability for genuine connection and belonging within the larger system.
That rings true. A shared reality, even if it's a difficult one, is pretty fundamental to feeling like you're part of the same system. If different groups are living in fundamentally different realities, the system's cohesion suffers.
It does. The paper then turns to Vance's perspective on the relationship between labor and innovation. He pushes back against the idea that the interests of working people and technologists are inherently in conflict.
He's quoted saying, "These are not necessarily in conflict. Ultimately, success is defined by the extent to which we synthesize these things."
Yeah.
And more pointedly, this idea that we can separate the making of things from the innovating of things is, I think, totally farcical.
The paper identifies this as a key systems thinking insight, instead of seeing labor and innovation as competing forces in a zero-sum game. Right. Vance is, in the paper's view, advocating for a systemic approach that seeks synergy and integration. He's saying the goal isn't to choose one over the other, but to design a system where they reinforce each other.
And that quote about not separating making things from innovating things seems to directly connect R&D, scientific truth data generation, with production, economic exchange.
Exactly. The paper uses this to illustrate Vance's call for fostering a robust domestic ecosystem where research and development, the generation of new science truth data, is intimately connected with and reinforced by production, economics exchange.
Okay.
This integration is not just about efficiency. The paper argues it also helps create a stronger sense of shared purpose and membership art across different sectors of the economy and different segments of the workforce.
How so?
Well, innovators work alongside makers, creating a more integrated, resilient system with a stronger sense of collective endeavor. People feel part of the same project.
That feels like a powerful example of how bringing different domains of the framework together, science, economics, and art, can describe a more effective and cohesive system.
It shows a desire to move beyond siloed thinking, to design a system where different elements work together synergistically towards shared goals. Now, the paper dedicates significant attention to Vance's critique of the state of education, particularly higher education.
Right, you mentioned this was key.
And this section is highlighted as central to the paper's overarching theme of education as agency.
He argues that the university model is broken and is failing in its fundamental role, even violating the social contract. What specific systemic failures does he pinpoint, according to the paper?
The paper outlines several points Vance makes. Firstly, he questions the commitment of some institutions to the pursuit of truth data, science, by citing the widely discussed reproducibility crisis in fields like biology.
The reproducibility crisis.
Yeah, it refers to the alarming difficulty researchers have in getting the same results when they attempt to replicate previously published scientific studies. Vance points to this failure of basic scientific rigor as evidence that the core process of generating reliable data and pursuing objective truth within these institutions is compromised.
So, if the very institutions responsible for generating fundamental knowledge and training the next generation of scientists aren't upholding basic scientific standards, then the quality of the input data for the entire system is degraded at the source.
That's the paper's interpretation, that a failure in the educational domain directly impacts the science truth data domain. Vance also strongly critiques the pervasive ideological homogeneity he observes on campuses,
Okay, the lack of diverse viewpoints.
citing examples where the vast majority of faculty may align with one political viewpoint. He describes environments where individuals are terrified they were going to lose their job for saying something that was a little bit outside the Overton window.
The Overton window being the range of acceptable ideas.
Right. Vance calls this environment totalitarian and fundamentally opposed to the free exchange of ideas. He says we need to be more open to unacceptable inquiry and let bright young minds go wherever the truth leads them.
Okay, so he's critiquing the lack of intellectual diversity and open debate. Now, how does the paper analyze why this ideological homogeneity, viewed through the system's framework, is a systemic failure that goes beyond just political preference?
This is where the paper really expands on the systemic implications. It argues that an environment within educational institutions that stifles dissenting views, where students and faculty are afraid to express ideas outside a narrow range, fundamentally degrades the functioning of all 5 domains of the system's framework, not just one.
All 5. How so? How does a lack of intellectual diversity in universities impact all 5 areas? Let's break that down.
Okay, let's try, based on the paper's line of argument. First, science truth data. Stifled inquiry hinders the objective pursuit of truth. Diverse perspectives are essential for challenging assumptions, identifying biases, exploring uncomfortable facts,
All right, you need disagreement to sharpen ideas.
and ensuring the rigor of scientific methodology, like replication. If everyone thinks alike, blind spots multiply, and the quality of generated data suffers. Research questions challenging orthodoxy might not get asked.
Okay, makes sense for science. What about art membership?
Art membership. Ideological homogeneity creates an environment where conformity is valued over genuine intellectual exploration. Those who hold different views feel excluded, alienated, or forced to hide their true thoughts.
So it damages the feeling of belonging.
Exactly. It actively works against the formation of genuine intellectual membership and shared community based on open dialogue. The beauty of a vibrant, diverse intellectual ecosystem is replaced by the rigid, fragile structure of an echo chamber. Belonging becomes conditional.
Okay. And religion values, how does homogeneity affect that?
Religion values. Universities are meant to be places where fundamental values are debated and examined. If only a narrow set of values is permissible, the ability to critically assess different ethical frameworks and make sound judgments is compromised.
Students don't get the full picture.
Right. They aren't exposed to a full spectrum of thought necessary to develop robust, well-reasoned value systems of their own. The institution implicitly, or sometimes explicitly, imposes a value hierarchy instead of fostering the skills to derive one critically.
Okay. What about economics exchange? That seems less direct.
Economics exchange. It's maybe less direct, but ideological homogeneity can impact the study and understanding of economic exchange and markets. If certain economic theories or critiques are considered unacceptable, the capacity to generate nuanced understanding or innovative solutions for complex economic problems is limited.
You might miss important perspectives on how markets really work.
Potentially, yes, it can lead to a failure to accurately perceive or analyze the real-world dynamics of markets and resource allocation from multiple angles.
And finally, politics action.
Politics force action. Ultimately, a failure in education to foster critical thinking and intellectual diversity undermines the system's ability to inform effective political action. If future leaders, policymakers, and citizens are educated in environments that discourage open inquiry,
They won't be equipped for the real world's complexity.
they will be less equipped to analyze complex problems from multiple angles, engage in robust democratic debate, or make informed judgments that lead to effective collective action based on a comprehensive understanding of the system.
Wow, so the paper really uses the framework to show how, in Vance's view, this failure in the education domain doesn't stay contained. It metastasizes and degrades the functioning of the entire societal system by compromising its ability to generate truth, foster cohesion, determine values, understand economics, and take effective action.
That's the paper's interpretation, that a system failure in cultivating intellectual openness has cascading negative impacts across all the core human endeavors. Vance's call, in the paper's analysis, is for the educational system to recommit to its fundamental role in fostering the open pursuit of truth and genuine intellectual exchange.
And he connects this systemic failure to the need for accountability.
Yes. Vance is quoted stating that institutions like Harvard need to accept democratic accountability and reform, or face consequences like government reevaluation of support.
So using political leverage.
The paper analyzes this as a direct call for political action, the application of force via governance and policy to address the systemic failures Vance identifies in the educational system. It's not just a lament. It's a demand for intervention to realign a broken part of the system.
And how does all of this tie into the paper's theme of education as agency?
This is where the paper brings it home. It explicitly links Vance's critique of the broken university model to this crucial theme. An educational system that stifles critical thinking, discourages diverse viewpoints, and compromises the pursuit of objective truth fundamentally fails to equip citizens with the necessary capacities.
To act effectively in the world, to have
Yeah,
agency.
exactly. It fails to equip them to navigate a complex world and exercise agency within its systems.
Because to be an agent in a complex system, you need the ability to gather and evaluate information, science data, understand how people connect and form communities, art membership, decide what's important and make choices, religion, value, judgment, understand how resources flow, economics exchange, and participate in collective decision-making and action, politics force. You need all those pieces.
Precisely. If the system that is supposed to cultivate these very capacities, education, is broken, then it inhibits the ability of citizens to understand the system, evaluate the claims of leaders, make informed judgments, and effectively participate in shaping their world. The paper highlights Vance's advice to young policy professionals to ignore the gatekeepers and replace them
Right.
as an explicit call to exercise this lost or suppressed agency, to use their own cultivated understanding and courage to challenge and reform the existing system's leadership structures.
So the paper sees Vance's points about education not just as an institutional critique, but as absolutely vital to the health of the entire societal system, specifically its ability to produce citizens capable of critical thought and systemic understanding, who can then hold the system and its leaders accountable and exercise their own power.
That's right. It's a critique that, viewed through this lens, touches on the health of the system at its most fundamental level, the capacity of its individual components, its citizens, to understand and interact effectively within it.
Okay, this has been a deep dive into the framework and how it's applied. Let's bring this all together. The paper's synthesis is that both Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance, despite their different political focuses and styles, demonstrate an engagement with systems thinking principles, as interpreted through this specific framework.
Yes, the paper argues that their remarks, when analyzed through the 10 systems thoughts, reveal that they are grappling with the interconnected realities of modern statecraft, even if they aren't explicitly using systems terminology.
It's like an implicit understanding.
Their arguments reflect an understanding, perhaps intuitive, of how complex systems function. That's the interpretation offered.
And what are the key systems concepts the paper sees reflected across their remarks, highlighting this underlying systemic view?
Several key concepts emerge clearly from the analysis. Interconnectedness is very prominent in both. Rubio linking the domestic economy directly to geopolitics and industrial capacity to national security. Vance connecting education to innovation, labor, and national cohesion, and seeing the economy tied to the good life. They see that challenges don't exist in isolation.
They understand that pulling one thread affects the whole fabric.
Precisely. Feedback loops are also highlighted. Rubio detailing the negative cycle set in motion by offshoring that degraded multiple parts of the system. Vance discussing how academic homogeneity can reinforce intellectual stagnation. They recognize that actions have consequences that cycle back and influence the system's state.
The system isn't just a one-way street of cause and effect.
Exactly. The importance of the external environment is also clear in both. Both speakers acknowledge how the global context, geopolitical competition, the actions and practices of other nations, global supply chains, profoundly impacts the domestic system.
The nation isn't in a vacuum.
Right. The nation system operates within a larger global system,
And they both call for a reevaluation of priorities, of what matters most.
which points to values and judgment as drivers. Both speakers, through this lens, are seen as calling for a recalibration of the core values guiding the nation, which in turn should drive political judgments and subsequent actions.
Okay.
They argue that past judgments, based on different values, like pure global economic efficiency, led to detrimental outcomes.
And finally, they both ultimately focus on the tangible results, or lack thereof, of how the system is functioning.
Which the paper links to the outputs of systems. They are concerned with what the system is actually producing for citizens and for the nation. Stagnating wages, lost industrial capacity, national vulnerability, educational failures. They are evaluating the system based on its real-world outputs across different domains.
So the paper's powerful conclusion here is that viewing their discourse through the 10 systems thoughts lens, reveals this underlying, often implicit, understanding that societal well-being and national strength emerge from the complex, dynamic interplay of truth data, membership beauty, value judgment, exchange markets, and force action.
That's the idea.
It's not about mastering one domain, but seeing how they all function as an integrated whole.
Yes, that's the synthesis presented in the paper. It suggests that effective statecraft today demands looking at challenges systemically because the nature of the challenges themselves is systemic.
Which brings us to the paper's ultimate takeaway, that truly effective statecraft in the 21st century fundamentally requires systems thinking because the defining challenges are interconnected, not isolated problems you can solve one by one.
The paper frames the analyses of Rubio and Vance through this specific framework as examples of leaders who are, in different ways and from different perspectives, grappling with these undeniable systemic realities.
Whether they call it systems thinking or not.
Right. The complexity of the world is pushing leaders towards this kind of thinking, consciously or not. That's the argument.
And the paper places particular emphasis on Vance's points about education and the theme of education as agency as being absolutely vital in this context.
Critically vital. The paper underscores why this matters so profoundly for you, the listener. In a complex, interconnected world where leaders are navigating intricate systems, citizens need critical thinking skills, intellectual openness, and the capacity for systemic understanding more than ever.
Why? Why is it so critical for us?
Well, to evaluate the claims and proposed solutions of those in power, to understand the potential ripple effects of policies, to make informed choices, and most importantly, to exercise their own agency in holding the system accountable and helping to shape its future.
So it's about being able to participate effectively.
Yes. If the fundamental societal system for cultivating these capacities, education, is failing, as Vance argues, it impacts the agency of every citizen.
So understanding systems isn't just an academic exercise or something just for politicians. It's increasingly necessary for an informed and empowered citizenry to function effectively in modern society.
Precisely. And the paper suggests that using a framework like the 10 systems thoughts to analyze political discourse helps us move beyond simply reacting to partisan rhetoric.
Get past the noise.
It provides a structured way to understand the underlying systemic challenges that different approaches are attempting or failing to address, and to see the different mental models of the complex system that are at play.
And the paper leaves us with that powerful concluding image of the nation itself, not as a static entity, but as a system of systems.
Right.
Something dynamic, complex, constantly interacting and evolving.
A living, breathing, intricate entity. And navigating and improving it requires an understanding of its often counterintuitive workings and maybe the humility to recognize how interventions in one area can echo throughout the whole.
This has been a deeply insightful exploration into a unique way of analyzing governance and political discourse. We've built up the Statecraft as systems craft, paper's core systems thinking framework, the 10 systems thoughts covering science data, art beauty, religion values judgment, economics markets, and politics action, and seen in detail how the author uses this powerful lens to interpret the remarks of Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance, revealing their engagement with systemic realities, according to the paper.
It's a framework that helps illuminate the interconnectedness of our challenges and reveals the complexity leaders are grappling with, as seen through the author's analysis. And it powerfully highlights the critical need for a citizenry equipped with the capacity for critical, systemic thinking to navigate and participate in today's world.
Which leaves us with this thought for you to ponder. Given the incredible complexity of the system of systems that we all live in, and the critical necessity for both leaders and citizens to understand its dynamics, how can you, in your own life and your engagement with the world, best cultivate the kind of systemic understanding and the agency needed to effectively navigate and influence the complex reality around you?
It feels like a question that becomes more urgent the deeper you dive into this stuff.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.